It's funny you should say that. When I saw Thor 2,
Yeah.
I saw it at Westchester, and the funniest thing was before the movie started, they played those old Thor cartoons.
Yeah, really?
Yeah, it was fantastic.
Yeah.
They played those old, with you remember the one like with the Captain America throws his mighty shield.
I can still sing the theme song.
Yeah, well, they were playing those.
If my voice wasn't so hoarse, I'd be singing them right now.
It was wild, and like I said, well, I got my kids. They appreciate the books because, also the former teacher, there's a cognitive connection between turning pages, holding the thing. If I got this,
words and pictures.
I read this, I can put this down whenever I want. I have to worry about my battery dying out on my computer.
Right.
Right.
Well, when I do some of my lectures about comic book history, I start out with the cave paintings, which were sequential images to tell a story. And then I go to Egyptian hieroglyphics when they added, in a sense, text, the cuneiforms. And then you go to the medieval broadsides, which were sequential images put up in the town square with text underneath. So this idea of sequential images to tell a story supplemented by verbal information as man learned to speak and talk and use language is very human friendly. So it's funny when you said, Arlen, where do you see comics going? Words and pictures are always going to be together. Look at the computer. Everything we're doing is visuals with words, even on the computer.
Yeah, but it's not a comic book.
It's not a comic, but it's words and pictures. And that's what comics are.
I'm just saying, to take from there, do you feel that, just to even further go back, you said it's an all-time high in reference to Gotham, Flash, all these things on television, and all these
they even got
characters.
The Supergirl now.
Right, in the movies. But, is that going to kill it? Is it going to be like a bubble and pop? Do you feel that it's really killing the genre because it's just about rehashing these?
Well, like I said, what is sad is that every person buying a ticket to that Avengers movie that made billions of dollars probably doesn't know the name Jack Kirby, or his name is typeset the same size as the key grip. You know what I mean? And it's like that's what I find sad is that the influence, everybody's seeing the movies, and when you go to a comic convention now, the reason why the convention scene is bursting is because all these people, these parents with their kids, taking them to these movies, they want to take them to conventions to find out more about these characters. But I find it a little sad that, again, the conglomerates that own these companies, I don't think are doing enough to promote the history of where these characters come from. They only keep the comic book companies around, I think very cynically, just to keep the licensing. Because if you know your copyright law, you've got to actively keep your license around. And that means they've got to keep publishing. But I don't think Warner Brothers or Disney cares whether a comic book sells 100,000 copies or 5,000 copies. All they care is that they know they have to keep them published. And that's it.
And I disagree with you. I think a lot of times, unfortunately, the parents are bringing the kids to get that T-shirt, to get that toy they can't get anywhere else, to get the new video game that, again, promotes the toy. I think there's a lot of purists that love comic books and really want to bring the next generation into it. But that's kind of where I was wondering where you were going to go with it, because the commercialism is so large that it might burn out. It might burn people out to...
But look at children's books. That is an industry that is not dying. The children's book market is healthy. The average parent, we all grew up learning how to read from comics. I never was into children's books. My mother didn't buy that. She never read Dr. Seuss to us. I learned how to read, like a whole generation, from the comic books themselves before I ever learned how to read, because the pictures suck you into it. I remember sounding out words like invulnerable and things like that, you know?
So, I mean, boom, crash.
Exactly. I mean, you know, our vocabulary to this day comes out of comics. I mean, I remember as a kid, Batman had a villain named Mr. Incognito. Now, the word incognito is Latin for disguise. I was the only 8-year-old that knew that. But when the average parent wants to buy reading material for their children, they don't know where a comic book store is. And if they did, they don't want to go into it because it looks like a boys' club. You know what I mean? Yeah. Even though there's more women than ever. But my point is that there isn't an active drive by the companies themselves to produce comics in the children's book format in the real bookstores or online where parents are buying reading material for their children.
In the last 2 years, just in my area alone, 5 comic book stores closed down. There's only one left. And he's right, 100. I did that article for our site last month, Batman and Spider-Man, 100,000 copies, and that was the hit. I mean, come on.
Yeah, but I mean, that's actually the biggest sellers. The average comic book by Martin Lee, I think, sells 4,000 copies.
That's horrible. Wow.
So it's really, again, it's very bittersweet when you talk about, you know, I did a lecture on the Lower East Side a year ago in Manhattan where Jack Kirby was raised, and it was for the Kirby Museum. And Kirby's real Jewish name was Yaakov Kurtzberg. So I did a lecture called Yaakov Kurtzberg, King of Comics, with the whole idea as a pun that, you know, how many comic book people even know, at this point, forget about them knowing Yaakov Kurtzberg, how many of them know Jack Kirby? Wow. And that's what I'm working actively in my own way, on my own in a way, to kind of reverse.
Wow. We actually had you know Glenn Fleming, right?
Well, I know him online.
Yeah, but we had him on our show a few weeks ago, and we talked about Kirby.
Yeah.
And how next Monday, the 29th, after the Jewish holidays this coming up week, the Supreme Court is going to say whether or not they're going to into this case. And, you know, it's a big, big case. It's not just, you know, the copyright, whatever. I mean, you got now Hollywood, 3 of the biggest guilds send in amicus briefs in support of the Kirby family. 2 former big names in the trademark and registrar sent in. I mean, now, you know, it really comes down to like guys like you and I who Mr. Adams were influenced. We were influenced by Mr. Neil Adams and Mr. Jack Kirby. I mean, what are we gonna do if we can't?
Well, you know what? Just to clarify for the people that are listening, all those guys were basically freelance artists in a work-for-hire situation in which the company owned everything you did. But in the same way that the record companies went back with the black bluesmen who were ripped off by the white record companies, even though legally, technically, those black bluesmen didn't own a thing, modern courts are able to look back at those contracts and declare them onerous and do the ethically and morally right thing. The comic book industry is far behind the record industry, the movie industry, in terms of taking care of its forefathers. So guys like Kirby, Ditko, who created Spider-Man with Stan Lee, you know, none of them own these characters or the artwork that they produce. So if the Supreme Court comes down on the side of Kirby, it's going to open up literally this can of worms for all of these creators who, you know, back then, the act of getting published and cashing the check, by signing the check, you were signing over the rights. So Siegel and Schuster were 18 years old in 1938 when they sold that 10-page story of the first Superman to DC Comics for $130. The act of selling those 10 pages gave DC Comics the rights to Superman in perpetuity. Wow. And as I like to say, that was the biggest ripoff to take place on Manhattan Island since the island was sold by the Indians for $26.
Wow.
Oh, but Neil stepped up for those guys, didn't he? He got the pension. Man,
in the mid '70s, when the first Superman movie was announced, the Salkins were the producers, and they paid DC in 1974 the whopping sum of $80 million for the rights to Superman. Now, today, that's chump change. In those days, in the 70s, astronomical. At the same time, Jerry Siegel, the writer, was working as a messenger boy in New York City. Joe Shuster, the artist of Superman, was legally blind and living in a halfway house. So Siegel wrote an article that Neil Adams happened to see, all about how him and Joe were screwed out of Superman, and here's DC Comics making $80 million. Wow. So Neil Adams, he had the clout back then as the big kahuna in the comic industry, and he started a grassroots campaign that really we need to model the current campaigns on, because he conceded the legal aspects. He knew Siegel and Schuster legally did not own a thing. He fought the battle on an ethical, moral level and basically shamed Warner Brothers into doing the right thing by Siegel and Schuster. And it worked. And Siegel and Schuster got a stipend for the rest of their lives, which was still a drop in the bucket. I think they got $20,000 a year. I mean, that's nothing. But they got their names on the strip. And nowadays, people are fighting for Bill Finger, who was Bob Kane's writer partner. You know, Batman should have been Kane and Finger like Siegel and Schuster was for Superman.